It was supposed to be the proudest moment of her career. After years of hard work, long nights of studying, and countless hours in the cockpit, Captain Naomi Carter had finally made it. She wasn't just any pilot, she was one of the best. With a perfect record and glowing recommendations, she had every reason to believe her next step would be smooth. But life doesn't always play fair. On the day of her final interview with Spylake Airlines, the very company she had dreamed of flying for, Naomi walked into the headquarters with her head held high. She had done everything right. She had the experience, the skills, and the passion. But as soon as she stepped inside, something felt off. The receptionist's eyes darted up and down, scanning her with a look Naomi had seen before. A polite but hesitant smile. A quick glance at her resume, then a pause. "Excuse me," the woman said, picking up the phone and whispering into the receiver. Naomi caught only a few words, her name, pilot, and something about double-checking. She had been in this industry long enough to recognize the signs. Minutes later, a sharply dressed man entered the lobby. His name was Mr. Langford, the airline's director of operations. He smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Captain Carter," he said, extending a hand. "There seems to be a little confusion." Naomi raised an eyebrow. "Confusion?" Well, he hesitated, glancing at the papers in his hand. "Your resume is impressive, but there must have been a misunderstanding. You see, we aren't currently looking for candidates with your background." There it was. She had heard this excuse before, wrapped in different words, but always carrying the same message. It wasn't about her skills. It wasn't about her experience. It was about her asterisk. Naomi forced herself to stay calm. "I applied through the official recruitment process," she said, keeping her voice steady. "I passed every requirement. I was invited for this interview." Langford sighed, shifting uncomfortably. "I'm afraid there's nothing we can do." Nothing they could do. She had spent her entire career proving she belonged in that seat. She had trained alongside pilots who were hired without question. But for her, there was always a reason, always a barrier. Naomi took a deep breath. She could argue. She could fight. She had the qualifications to challenge them legally. But as she stood there, looking at Langford's indifferent face, she realized something. She didn't want to work for them. She didn't want to beg for a seat at a table that was never meant to welcome her. She had dedicated years of her life to this industry, and she wasn't about to let one company define her worth. So she turned on her heels and walked out. But she wasn't done. What happened next would shake the entire airline industry to its core. Spylake Airlines had no idea that they had just denied not only an exceptional pilot, but also a woman with the power to change everything. And change everything she did. Because Naomi wasn't going to let them win. She was going to make sure they regretted it. And when she was done, Spylake Airlines would never be the same again. Stay tuned, because this is just the beginning. Naomi Carter walked out of Spylake Airlines headquarters with her heart pounding, her mind racing. The sting of rejection wasn't new, but this time it felt different. This wasn't just another setback, it was an insult. She had spent years proving herself, breaking through barriers, earning her place. And yet, in a single moment, she had been dismissed as if none of it mattered. She gripped the strap of her flight bag tighter, the cool breeze brushing against her face as she stepped into the parking lot. She had options. She could take legal action, go to the media, or fight this publicly. But deep down, Naomi knew that wouldn't change the system. Skylink wasn't the only airline that operated like this. It was just one of many, hiding behind polished marketing and hollow promises of diversity, while keeping the same outdated attitudes behind closed doors. She sat in her car for a long time, staring at the city's skyline ahead. This was supposed to be her moment, the job that would take her career to the next level. Instead, she was back at square one. But as she sat there, frustration turning into something sharper, something clearer, an idea began to form. Maybe she didn't need Skylink. Maybe she didn't need their approval, their acceptance, or their permission. Naomi had spent her whole career working twice as hard for half the recognition. What if, instead of waiting for a door to open, she built her own? The thought sent a surge of adrenaline through her. She had connections, other pilots, flight crews, mechanics, people who, like her, had been overlooked or pushed aside. People who were tired of the same old system. What if they came together? What if they created something better? She pulled out her phone and scrolled through her contacts. One name stood out: Derek Hayes, an old friend and one of the best aviation engineers she knew. He had worked for major airlines before getting fed up with the politics and starting his own consulting firm. If anyone would understand what she was thinking, it was him. She hit the call button. "Naomi Carter," Derek's voice came through the speaker. "Didn't expect to hear from you today. What's up?" She took a breath. "I just walked out of an interview at Skylink." "Let me guess, they found a reason to say no." His voice carried the same tired frustration she felt. "Something like that." She leaned back against her seat, gripping the steering wheel. "I'm done, Derek. I'm done waiting for them to give me a chance." There was a pause, then curiosity in his tone. "What are you thinking?" "I'm thinking we don't need them," she said. "What if we started our own airline?" Silence. For a moment, she wondered if the call had dropped. Then Derek let out a low whistle. "You don't do anything small, do you?" She smiled, but her mind was already spinning, already working through the details. "I'm serious. There are pilots out there, like me, who keep hitting the same wall. Flight attendants, mechanics, ground crews, people who are tired of being passed over. What if we created something different? An airline that actually values skill over politics?" Derek was quiet for a moment. When he finally spoke, there was something different in his voice. "You know, that's not the craziest thing I've heard." Naomi felt a spark of hope. It wouldn't be easy, she admitted. "We'd need investors, aircraft, licensing, but I know people. And if we do this right, we wouldn't just be starting an airline. We'd be changing the industry." Derek chuckled. "You always did think big. All right, Captain Carter, let's talk." Naomi's pulse quickened. This was happening. She didn't know how yet, but for the first time since walking out of Skylink, she felt something she hadn't felt in a long time. Power. But she had no idea just how much trouble that power was about to bring. Naomi could barely sleep that night. The idea had taken root, and now it was all she could think about. She had spent years following the rules, believing that hard work alone would be enough to get her where she wanted to be. But the truth had always been right in front of her. The system wasn't broken. It was built this way, and she was done playing by its rules. The next morning, she met Derek at a small cafe near the airport. He was already at a corner table, a cup of coffee in one hand, his laptop open in front of him. "You really meant it, didn't you?" he said as she sat down. Naomi nodded. "I haven't stopped thinking about it." Derek leaned back, rubbing his chin. "Starting an airline isn't like opening a coffee shop. We need serious money. Planes, permits, staff, maintenance." "I know," Naomi cut in. "But think about it. If we could get the right people together, we wouldn't have to start big. We just need one plane, one route, something to prove that we can do this." Derek studied her for a moment. "You already have people in mind, don't you?" She smirked. "I made some calls this morning." In just a few hours, she had pulled together a list of pilots, engineers and flight attendants who had been overlooked or pushed out by major airlines. Some had been passed over for promotions, others let go under suspicious circumstances. Every single one of them was eager for something new. Derek exhaled slowly. All right, let's see how far we can take this. Over the next few weeks, Naomi and Derek worked nonstop. They held meetings in borrowed office spaces, made phone calls at all hours, and reached out to investors who might be willing to take a risk. And then, finally, a breakthrough. A private investor, an entrepreneur with a love for aviation, agreed to fund their first aircraft. It wasn't a massive jet, but it was enough to get them off the ground. Word started spreading fast. The idea of an airline that actually valued its employees, that put pilots and crew first, was something the industry had never seen before. People were paying attention, and that's when the trouble started. One evening, Naomi received a message from an anonymous number. Asterisk, you don't know what you're getting into. Walk away while you still can asterisk. She stared at the words on her phone, her stomach tightening. She had expected resistance, competition, skepticism, even some backlash. But this was something else. A few days later, a potential investor suddenly pulled out with no explanation. Then their paperwork for securing their first flight route was delayed without a clear reason. Naomi started noticing unfamiliar faces at their meetings. People who claimed to be interested but asked too many questions, pressed for details that didn't seem relevant. And then came the news that stopped her in her tracks. Skylink Airlines had just announced a new initiative, one that sounded eerily similar to hers. A program promising to give underrepresented pilots better opportunities. A complete shift from how they had operated before. Naomi clenched her fists as she read the press release. This wasn't a coincidence. Skylink wasn't just watching her. They were trying to shut her down before she even got started. But they didn't realize one thing. She wasn't backing down. If they wanted a fight, she was ready. Naomi sat in her car, gripping the steering wheel as she reread the article on her phone. Skylink's announcement wasn't just a coincidence. It was a direct attack. They were trying to control the narrative, making it seem like they were suddenly champions of diversity and inclusion while working behind the scenes to crush her efforts. She had expected pushback, but this was something else. This was war. She called Derek immediately. "Did you see it?" "Yeah," he said, his voice tense. "They're moving fast. And it's not just talk. I checked around. Skylink is suddenly reaching out to pilots and crews they ignored before. They're trying to lock people in with contracts before we can." Naomi exhaled sharply. "They don't want us to succeed." "They're scared," Derek corrected, "because they know we're onto something real." But fear wasn't Skylink's only weapon. Over the next few days, things started going wrong. Small things at first, calls that weren't returned, meetings that were mysteriously canceled. Then bigger issues. The leasing company they had lined up for their first aircraft suddenly backed out, citing concerns about risk. A permit they had applied for weeks ago was now under review. Investors who had shown interest started getting cold feet. Naomi wasn't stupid. She knew exactly what was happening. Someone with power was pulling strings behind the scenes, making sure every door slammed shut before she could walk through it. Then the threats became more direct. One evening, after a long day of fighting through roadblocks, she found her apartment door slightly open. Her breath caught in her throat. She knew she had locked it. She stepped inside cautiously, her heart pounding. Nothing was stolen, but something was different. The stack of documents she had left on her kitchen table, notes about the airline, investor contacts, plans, was scattered across the floor, as if someone had gone through them and wanted her to know. A chill ran down her spine. This wasn't just competition anymore. Someone wanted to scare her. She called Derek. "I think someone broke into my place." He was silent for a moment. Then his voice was low. "Naomi, this is getting serious." She ran a hand through her hair, trying to steady herself. "I know." "We need to be careful," he warned. "Whoever is behind this, they're not just trying to stop us. They want to make sure we don't even try." Naomi sat down, her pulse still racing. The logical part of her knew he was right. But another part, the part of her that had fought to get this far, that had refused to accept defeat, wasn't ready to stop. "We keep going," she said finally. "If they're this desperate to shut us down, it means we're closer than they want us to be." Derek sighed. "I had a feeling you'd say that." The next day, she met with her team in a small office space they had rented. The mood was tense, but there was determination in their eyes. Everyone had seen what Skylink was doing. Everyone understood the stakes. "We have two choices," Naomi told them. "We can back down, let them win, and go back to waiting for someone else to decide our future. Or we fight." Silence. Then, one by one, they nodded. Derek tapped his pen against the table. "If we're going to do this, we need to move fast. Before they shut down every path we have left." Naomi's jaw tightened. "Then we don't wait. We launch. Now." The room buzzed with energy. There was no turning back. But what Naomi didn't know was that Skylink wasn't done yet. They were about to make a move that would push everything to the breaking point. Just as Naomi and her team began making final preparations to launch, the first real hit landed. It wasn't just another delay or another investor pulling out. It was much bigger. Derek burst into the office, his face tight with frustration. He tossed a printed document onto the table. "They're suing us." Naomi blinked. "What?" "Skylink just filed a lawsuit." Derek exhaled sharply, rubbing a hand over his face. "They're claiming we stole proprietary information, that we're using their internal data to build our airline." Naomi grabbed the document and scanned the pages. It was a ridiculous claim. She had never worked for Skylink, and neither had Derek. There was no way they had access to anything private. But the details didn't matter. The goal was clear. Stall them, drain their resources, and bury them in legal battles before they even got off the ground. "This is a scare tactic," Naomi muttered. "They know we don't have time or money for this." Derek shook his head. "It gets worse. A few of the pilots who were ready to come on board with us. Skylink just offered them massive retention bonuses. And not just them. Mechanics, flight attendants, ground crew. They're throwing money at everyone we were about to hire." Naomi's stomach twisted. She couldn't blame anyone for taking the offers. Most of them had families to support, bills to pay. But Skylink wasn't doing this out of generosity. They didn't care about these employees. They just wanted to weaken her team. She sat back, tapping her fingers against the table. "All right, if they want to play dirty, we adjust." Derek frowned. "How? We're running out of people, money, and now we have a lawsuit hanging over our heads." Naomi's mind raced. Skylink was bigger, richer, more powerful. They had the connections to shut down every standard route she could take. But that didn't mean they were untouchable. She pulled out her phone and scrolled through her contacts. Then she found the number she needed. "Who are you calling?" Derek asked. Naomi's lips curled into a smirk. "Someone who knows Skylink better than anyone." She hit dial. A few seconds later, a familiar voice picked up. "I was wondering when you'd call." It was Jordan Lee, a former Skylink executive. A man who had spent years working in their corporate offices before he was abruptly let go under suspicious circumstances. You saw the lawsuit? Naomi asked. Jordan chuckled. Saw it. I knew it was coming before they even filed it. Naomi exchanged a glance with Derek. You know something, don't you? I know a lot of things, Jordan said. And if Skylink is pulling this stunt, it means they're hiding something. They wouldn't go this far unless they were trying to keep you from finding it. Naomi leaned forward. Then tell me what they don't want me to know. Jordan hesitated, then sighed. All right, but not over the phone. This is bigger than you think. Naomi's pulse quickened. She had expected resistance, but this was something else. She ended the call and looked at Derek. We're not just fighting an airline, she said. Something else is going on. And whatever it is, Skylink is willing to do anything to keep it buried. Derek exhaled, shaking his head. Naomi, are you sure about this? She didn't hesitate. I've never been more sure of anything in my life. But she had no idea just how dangerous the truth would be. Naomi sat in the dimly lit booth of a quiet diner, her fingers wrapped around a cup of coffee that had long gone cold. Across from her, Jordan leaned back in his seat, his eyes scanning the room before he spoke. I worked for Skylink for 15 years, he said. I know how they operate, what they're doing to you. It's not just about competition. They're scared because if you succeed, people will start asking questions. Naomi frowned. Questions about what? Jordan pulled out a folder from his bag and slid it across the table. Naomi opened it, her breath catching as she flipped through the pages. Flight maintenance logs, financial reports, internal emails, documents that should have never left Skylink's headquarters. They've been covering up safety violations, Jordan said. Cutting corners on maintenance, falsifying records, pushing planes to fly when they should be grounded. Naomi's stomach turned. And no one's caught this. They have, Jordan said bitterly. But Skylink has friends in the right places. They make problems disappear. Whistleblowers get paid off or pushed out before they can say too much. That's why I left. Derek, who had been silent up until now, finally spoke. Let me guess. They think Naomi might expose this. Jordan nodded. They're not just trying to stop you from launching your airline. They're trying to make sure no one digs too deep. Naomi's hands tightened around the papers. Everything made sense now. The sudden lawsuit, the disappearing investors, the threats. Skylink wasn't just protecting its business. It was covering up something dangerous. She exhaled slowly. So what do we do? She exhaled slowly. So what do we do? Jordan smirked. That depends. Do you want to win? Or do you want to take them down? Naomi met his gaze, her pulse steady. Both. The next morning, she made her move. She and Derek gathered every piece of evidence Jordan had given them and sent it to investigative journalists, federal regulators, and key industry leaders. Within hours, the story exploded. News outlets ran headlines exposing Skylink's violations, whistleblowers came forward with their own testimonies, and passengers who had experienced mechanical failures on flights started speaking out. Skylink's executives scrambled to contain the damage, but it was too late. Investors pulled their funding, regulatory agencies launched investigations, and lawsuits from former employees piled up. The airline that had tried to crush Naomi was now fighting to survive. But the biggest shock came days later. Skylink's CEO resigned unexpectedly, and within hours, a leaked memo revealed that top executives had known about the safety violations for years. The scandal wasn't just about business. It had put lives at risk. The airline's stock plummeted, and within weeks, Skylink was forced to shut down entirely. Naomi stood in front of her team, watching the news play on the office TV. Derek leaned against the desk beside her. You did it, he said. She shook her head. "We did it." But just as she allowed herself a breath of relief, her phone buzzed. An unknown number. She hesitated, then answered. A low voice on the other end spoke. "You took down Skylink. Impressive, but you made some powerful enemies." Naomi's grip tightened on the phone. The voice chuckled. "Watch your back, Captain Carter. This was just the beginning." The line went dead. Naomi stared at her phone long after the call ended, the words still ringing in her ears. She had won, but at what cost? Skylink was gone, but the people who had protected it, who had allowed it to operate unchecked for years, were still out there. And they had just made it clear. They weren't done with her. Derek watched her carefully. Who was that? Naomi took a slow breath, then set her phone down. Someone who doesn't want this to be over. Derek frowned. "Naomi, maybe we should." She shook her head. "No, we keep going. We didn't come this far just to stop now." And she meant it. Taking down Skylink hadn't just been about proving herself or building her own airline. It had been about something much bigger, showing people that the industry could change, that no one should have to fight this hard just to be given a fair shot. In the weeks that followed, Naomi and her team pushed forward, refusing to be intimidated. With Skylink gone, doors that had once been slammed shut were now opening. Investors who had hesitated before were suddenly interested again. Former employees of Skylink, the ones who had been overlooked, pushed out, or silenced, were now reaching out to her, eager to be part of something new. And then finally, it happened. Their first flight took off. Naomi stood on the tarmac, watching as the plane lifted into the sky, a rush of emotions flooding through her. It had been a long road, full of setbacks, betrayals, and battles she hadn't been sure she could win. But now, in this moment, all of it had been worth it. Derek stood beside her, his hands in his pockets. "You did it, Captain Carter." Naomi smiled. "We did it." But as they turned to leave, she caught a glimpse of a black SUV parked near the airport fence, its tinted windows concealing whoever was inside. She didn't know if it was paranoia or instinct, but something told her this wasn't the last time she'd be looking over her shoulder. She exhaled, pushing the thought away. For now, she had a flight to catch. Her future wasn't behind her. It was in the sky, where she had always belonged.